I pulled my truck into the gravel parking area and sat there for a moment, staring at the weathered wooden building ahead. The ranger station looked smaller than I'd expected, just a single-story structure with peeling green paint and a metal roof that had seen better decades. But it represented everything I needed right now: isolation, quiet, and a paycheck, far away from the mess I'd left behind in Charlotte. The drive up the mountain had taken 3 hours, winding through dense forests that grew thicker and darker with each mile. I'd passed maybe 4 other vehicles the entire way, and the last gas station was 45 minutes behind me. Perfect. The further I got from traffic jams, apartment sirens, and the constant pressure of deadlines, the better. I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat and walked toward the front door. My boots crunched on fallen leaves that nobody had bothered to clear away. The whole place felt forgotten, like time moved differently here than it did in the rest of the world. The door opened before I could knock. A man in his 50s stepped out, wearing a faded uniform shirt and jeans that had seen plenty of outdoor work. His face was weathered in the way that comes from years of sun and wind, and his gray hair stuck out from under a baseball cap with a Park Service logo. "You Miller?" he asked. "Yes, sir, James Miller." "Robert Harrison, park manager." He looked me over with sharp eyes, taking in my clean hiking boots and new jacket. "Come on inside. We need to talk before you get settled." The interior of the station was basic but functional. A small office area with 2 desks, a kitchenette, and a narrow hallway that led to what I assumed were sleeping quarters. Maps covered most of the wall space, marked with colored pins and handwritten notes. The whole place smelled like coffee and old wood. Robert walked to one of the desks and picked up a piece of paper. He handed it to me without any explanation. I looked down at what appeared to be a typed list, single-spaced on white paper. The header read, "Essential Safety Protocols" in bold letters. "Read it," Robert said. I scanned the page. 6 numbered items, each one stranger than the last. The first rule told me never to go toward the sound of a baby crying in the forest, no matter how real it seemed. The second warned against making eye contact with any animal that had more than the normal number of body parts. I kept reading, my confusion growing with each line. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked. Robert's expression didn't change. "Do I look like I'm joking?" I studied his face. No hint of humor anywhere. "These rules, they don't make sense. They don't have to make sense. They just have to be followed. Every single one, every single time." Robert moved to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "You want to know about the last ranger who decided these rules were nonsense? His name was Marcus Webb. Started here in March, lasted 3 weeks. Found his truck at the bottom of Pine Ridge with no tire marks, no skid patterns, like something just picked it up and dropped it there." He opened the folder and showed me a stack of incident reports, each one paper-clipped to a photograph of a different person. Before Marcus, there was Jennifer Hawkins. Ignored rule number 4. We found her radio 2 miles from any trail, still transmitting static. Never found her. He flipped to another page. Tommy Martinez lasted 6 days. Kevin O'Sullivan made it almost a month before he decided he knew better. My hands felt cold as I looked through the photos. Young faces, mostly. People who looked like me, ready to start fresh, eager to prove themselves. "How many rangers have you lost?" I asked. "In the 15 years I've been running this station, 11. Robert closed the folder and put it back in the filing cabinet. "The ones who follow the rules go home to their families when their contracts end. The ones who don't," he gestured toward the cabinet, I looked down at the paper again. The rules seemed even more bizarre now, but the weight of those 11 missing people made them feel different. Less like a prank, and more like a lifeline I didn't understand. "What happens if I follow these exactly?" "Then you might survive your first month." Robert walked to the window and looked out at the forest beyond the parking area. "I'm not going to explain why these rules exist. You wouldn't believe me if I tried, And honestly, it's better if you don't ask questions. Just follow them, trust them, let them keep you alive. I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. Where's my bunk? Robert led me down the hallway to a small room with 2 single beds, a dresser, and a window that faced the woods. One of the beds was clearly occupied, personal items on the nightstand, clothes draped over a chair. Your roommate is Tyler Brooks, Robert said. Started 2 days ago. Good kid, eager to help. He's out on patrol right now, should be back before dark. I dropped my duffel bag on the empty bed and looked around the room. Simple, clean, isolated. Everything I'd wanted when I filled out the application online. The only sound was wind through the trees outside, a constant whisper that replaced the urban noise I'd grown tired of hearing. Robert handed me a radio and a flashlight. You'll start patrols tomorrow. Tonight, just get familiar with the station layout and read through the safety manual. He paused at the doorway. Ann Miller, keep that rules list with you at all times. Don't leave it sitting on your desk or tucked away in a drawer. When you need it, you won't have time to go looking for it. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I unpacked my clothes, read through the standard safety procedures, and studied the trail maps on the office walls. The station covered a lot of territory, nearly 50 square miles of mountain forest with only a handful of marked trails. Most of it was designated wilderness area, which meant minimal human presence and maximum solitude. Tyler returned just as the sun started setting behind the ridge. He was younger than me, maybe 24, with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he still believed this job would be an adventure rather than a way to hide from life. You must be James, he said, extending his hand. Tyler Brooks. Good to have another person around here. We talked for a while about our backgrounds. He'd studied forestry in college. I'd been managing inventory systems for a shipping company until the stress finally broke me. Neither of us mentioned why we'd ended up at a remote station that seemed to chew through employees, but I could tell Tyler was running from something too. Robert left around 8 o'clock, driving his pickup down the winding mountain road, with a final warning to lock all doors and windows after dark. Tyler and I heated up some canned soup for dinner and sat in the main office, comparing notes about what we'd learned so far. Did Robert give you the weird rules list? Tyler asked. I pulled the paper from my pocket. Yeah, what do you make of it? Tyler laughed and shook his head. I think the old man's been out here too long. Some of that stuff is completely insane. I mean, not going toward a crying baby. What if someone's actually in trouble? A chill ran through my stomach, but I tried to keep my voice casual. He seemed pretty serious about following them. Robert's paranoid. I get it. He's responsible for keeping us safe, so he comes up with these elaborate procedures to cover his own liability. But come on, rule number 3 says to whistle back if you hear whistling in the forest, like I'm supposed to have conversations with birds. I looked out the window at the darkening trees. Something about Tyler's dismissive attitude made me nervous, but I didn't know him well enough to argue. Maybe we should just follow them anyway. Can't hurt, right? I guess. But if I hear someone calling for help, I'm not going to stand around consulting a piece of paper while they die out there. We finished dinner and Tyler went to shower. I stayed in the office reading through the incident reports Robert had left on his desk. Missing hikers, unexplained equipment failures, rescue teams that found empty campsites with food still warm on the fire. The pattern stretched back decades, long before Robert had started managing the station. Tyler came back wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair still damp. I'm beat. Long day of hiking trails and checking fence lines. He stretched and headed toward our room. See you in the morning. I nodded and stayed at the desk, studying the maps and trying to memorize the trail markers. The station felt different with just me awake. Quieter, but also more tense. Every sound outside seemed amplified, from wind moving through branches to small animals rustling in the undergrowth. Around 10:30, I finally decided to get some sleep. I checked that the front door was locked, turned off the office lights, and walked down the hallway toward our room. Tyler was already in bed, his breathing deep and regular. I changed into sleeping clothes and lay down, listening to the forest sounds through the thin walls. It was peaceful in a way I'd forgotten existed. No traffic, no neighbors arguing, no police sirens cutting through the night. Just wind and trees and the distant call of an owl somewhere up the mountain. That's when I heard it. A baby crying. The sound came from somewhere beyond the station, out in the trees where no baby should be. It was clear and desperate, the kind of crying that made your chest tighten with the need to respond immediately. A child in distress, calling for help in the darkness. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. The first rule on Robert's list came back to me word for word. Never go toward the sound of a baby crying in the forest, no matter how real it seems, or how much distress it appears to be in. Tyler stirred in the other bed. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah." I reached for the rules list on my nightstand, but I already knew what it said. Tyler swung his legs out of bed and started putting on his boots. "Someone's in trouble out there. That kid sounds terrified." "Wait." I got up and grabbed his arm. "Robert's rules say not to go toward a baby crying." Tyler pulled away from me. "Are you serious? There's a baby out there crying for help and you want to follow some paranoid list instead of doing our job?" The crying continued, echoing through the trees with a clarity that suggested it was coming from multiple directions at once. But that was impossible. Sound didn't work that way in the forest. "Just listen to it for a second," I said. "Really listen." Tyler paused at the bedroom door, his hand on the frame. The crying was still going, but now that I was paying attention, something about it seemed wrong. The pitch was too perfect, too consistent. Real babies didn't cry with that kind of rhythmic precision. "I don't care if it sounds weird," Tyler said. "If there's even a chance someone needs help, I'm going." He grabbed his flashlight and headed for the front door. I followed him, still in my sleeping clothes. "Tyler, wait. Let's at least call Robert first." But Tyler was already unlocking the front door. The crying grew louder as he opened it, seeming to come from directly ahead of us, maybe 100 yards into the tree line. "I'll be right back," Tyler said. He clicked on his flashlight and stepped outside. "Tyler, don't!" I reached for him, but he was already jogging across the clearing toward the forest. I stood in the doorway, watching his flashlight beam bounce between the trees as he followed the sound. The crying continued, leading him deeper into the woods. I could hear Tyler calling out, trying to reassure whoever was out there that help was coming. Then his flashlight stopped moving. The crying cut off abruptly, leaving only silence. "Tyler?" I called. No response. I grabbed my own flashlight and stepped onto the porch, but something made me stop. The forest ahead looked different now, darker, denser, like the shadows between the trees had gotten thicker. I couldn't see Tyler's light anywhere. "Tyler!" I yelled louder. A scream answered me. Tyler's voice filled with terror and pain, coming from somewhere much deeper in the forest than he should have been able to reach in such a short time. The scream went on for several seconds, then changed into something that didn't quite sound human anymore. Then Tyler's flashlight beam appeared again, swinging wildly through the trees like he was fighting something. The light jerked left and right, up and down, moving in patterns that suggested Tyler was being dragged or thrown around. Another scream. Definitely Tyler, but distorted somehow, like his voice was being stretched or compressed. The flashlight beam suddenly shot upward, illuminating the canopy high above. It held that position for a moment, then disappeared completely. Silence. I stood on the porch for another minute, calling Tyler's name and listening for any sign of him. Nothing came back except the normal sounds of the forest. Wind, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I backed into the station and slammed the door, turning the deadbolt with shaking hands. I checked every window, making sure they were all locked, then dragged a desk chair over to block the front door. The rules list was still on my nightstand, I picked it up and read the first item again. Never go toward the sound of a baby crying in the forest, no matter how real it seems or how much distress it appears to be in. Tyler had lasted 2 days. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the office chair, watching the windows and listening for any sound that might be Tyler coming back. But I knew he wasn't coming back. Whatever had taken him was still out there, and I was alone in a building that suddenly felt far too small and vulnerable. When morning finally came, I unlocked the door and checked the area where Tyler had disappeared. His footprints were visible in the soft earth, leading about 30 feet into the trees before they simply stopped. No sign of a struggle, no disturbed vegetation, no indication of what direction he might have gone from there. Tyler Brooks was gone. I sat at the desk with the radio in front of me, staring at the microphone for what felt like an hour. The morning had crawled by in a haze of exhaustion and disbelief, Tyler's empty bed a constant reminder that last night had actually happened. I'd checked his belongings 3 times, hoping somehow I'd imagined the whole thing, but his hiking boots were still lined up next to the door and his toothbrush was still damp in the bathroom. The radio crackled with static when I finally picked up the microphone. I'd put off making this call as long as I could, but protocol demanded it. Missing person reports couldn't wait, even when you had no idea how to explain what you'd witnessed. Base station to Park Dispatch. Over. This is dispatch. Go ahead. Base station. I took a breath and tried to organize my thoughts into something that wouldn't get me transferred to a psychiatric facility. Need to file a missing person report for Tyler Brooks, ranger assigned to this station. He left the building last night around 10:30 p.m. and hasn't returned. Copy that. Any indication of where he might have gone? I looked out the window toward the tree line where Tyler's flashlight had disappeared. How was I supposed to explain that he'd chased the sound of a crying baby into the forest and been dragged away by something that wasn't human? He was responding to what he believed was a distress call in the forest. Last seen heading northeast from the station into the tree cover. Weather conditions last night? Clear, no precipitation. Any medical conditions or medications we should be aware of? None that I know of. The dispatcher continued through her checklist, asking about Tyler's experience level, his equipment, and whether he'd mentioned any plans to leave the station. I answered each question with the bare minimum, keeping my responses focused on facts I could prove. The crying baby, the unnatural echoes, Tyler's distorted screams. None of that belonged in an official report. After I finished with dispatch, I called Tyler's emergency contact number from his personnel file. His mother answered on the second ring, and I had to deliver the news that her son was missing in a national forest. She asked the same questions the dispatcher had, plus dozens more I couldn't answer. By the time I hung up, my hands were trembling and I felt sick to my stomach. I spent the next few hours cleaning the station and organizing Tyler's belongings, keeping myself busy while I waited for Robert to arrive. Every few minutes I'd catch myself listening for Tyler's voice or the sound of his boots on the porch, even though I knew he wasn't coming back. The silence felt different now, heavier, more threatening, like something was watching the station from the trees. Robert's pickup truck appeared on the access road just after noon, raising a cloud of dust as it wound up the mountain. I met him at the front door, and he took one look at my face before asking where Tyler was. "He's gone," I said. "Went into the forest last night and never came back." Robert's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not surprise, more like resignation. "Tell me what happened." I walked him through the events of the previous night, leaving out the supernatural elements, but describing Tyler's decision to ignore the rules and go toward the crying sound. Robert listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making notes in a small pad he pulled from his shirt pocket. "You hear this crying yourself?" he asked when I finished. "Yeah." "And you didn't go after him?" "The rules said not to." Robert studied me for a long moment, then walked to a filing cabinet I hadn't noticed before, a tall metal one tucked behind his desk. He unlocked it with a key from his belt and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book that looked like it had been used for decades. The cover was worn smooth, and the pages were yellowed around the edges. Robert opened it to a page about halfway through and began writing Tyler's name in careful block letters. Above Tyler's entry, I could see dozens of other names, each followed by a date and a brief description. Marcus Webb, 03 to 15, 2019, ignored Rule 4, investigated figure on trail Jennifer Hawkins, 8/22, 2018, responded to voices calling for help after dark Tommy Martinez, 11/07, 2017, made eye contact with Anomalous wildlife. The list went on, stretching back through the pages. Robert wrote Tyler Brooks, 10/28, 2023, pursued crying sounds in violation of Rule 1 and closed the book. He seemed like a good kid, Robert said, returning the logbook to its place in the cabinet. Eager to help people. Is that why they all... I gestured toward the filing cabinet. Most of them. Robert locked the cabinet and pocketed the key. The ones who want to be heroes don't last long up here. Mountains don't care about good intentions. He spent the next hour helping me box up Tyler's personal belongings and completing the paperwork that would officially remove him from the station roster. The process felt mechanical, like Robert had done this too many times to feel anything beyond professional obligation. Before he left, Robert checked the locks on all the windows and doors, testing each one twice. "You'll be alone here until we can arrange a replacement," he said. "Could be a few weeks, maybe longer. Most people don't want this assignment once they read the incident reports. I'll be fine. Maybe. You followed the rules last night, which puts you ahead of most new hires." Robert paused at the door. "But being alone changes things. Makes you second-guess yourself when weird stuff starts happening. If you hear voices, if you see things that don't make sense, if you get the urge to investigate strange sounds, don't. Radio for backup and wait for daylight." After Robert drove away, I tried to take a nap but couldn't stop thinking about Tyler's final screams echoing through the forest. I ended up reading through more incident reports instead, learning about the patterns of disappearances that stretched back to the 1970s. Missing hikers, vanished campers, search and rescue teams that found empty tents with no signs of struggle. The mountains seemed to have an appetite for people who wandered too far from the marked trails. Evening approached faster than I expected. The sun dropped behind the western ridge, leaving the valleys in shadow while the peaks still caught the last orange light. I checked my equipment, radio, flashlight, GPS unit, first aid kit, and set out for my required patrol of the Eastern Trail system. The path wound through dense pine forest, marked every quarter mile with reflective blazes nailed to tree trunks. I'd studied the route on Robert's maps, memorizing the key landmarks and turnaround points. The patrol was supposed to take 2 hours if I maintained a steady pace, checking for damaged signs, illegal camping, or evidence of poaching activity. I'd been walking for about 40 minutes when I saw the deer. It stood in the middle of the trail, maybe 50 yards ahead, completely motionless in the growing darkness. At first glance, it looked normal, the right size and coloring for a white-tailed deer standing in the alert posture that meant it had detected my presence. But as I got closer, my flashlight beam revealed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The deer had 7 antlers. Not 7 points on a normal rack, but 7 separate antlers growing from its skull at impossible angles. Some curved backward, others twisted to the side, and one grew straight down toward the animal's nose. The bone looked fresh and healthy, as if this configuration was perfectly natural instead of a biological nightmare. But it was the eyes that really got to me. They reflected my flashlight with the typical deer shine, but behind that reflection was something that looked disturbingly human. Intelligence, awareness, the kind of focused attention that suggested the creature was studying me as carefully as I was studying it. Rule number 2 came back to me, word for word. Do not make eye contact with any animal that has more than the normal number of body parts. Back away slowly and do not turn your back on it until you are at least 100 yards away. I forced myself to look at the ground instead of those unsettling eyes and began backing up the trail. My boots crunched softly on fallen leaves, each step carefully placed to avoid stumbling over rocks or roots. The deer's head turned to track my movement, but it didn't make any sound or attempt to follow. The retreat felt like it took forever. I counted my steps, stopping at 25 to check the deer's position without making eye contact. It was still standing in the same spot, that 7-antlered head turned in my direction. At 50 steps, I checked again. Still there, still watching. The human intelligence in those eyes made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't explain. I'd backed up nearly 50 yards when the deer finally moved. It turned away from me with smooth, graceful steps and melted into the forest shadows like it had never been there at all. One moment I could see its pale form between the trees. The next it had vanished completely. I stood there for another minute, listening for any sound that might indicate the creature was moving parallel to the trail or circling around behind me. Nothing but normal forest noise. Wind through branches, small animals rustling in the undergrowth, the distant call of an owl starting its nightly hunt. Only when I was certain the deer was gone did I continue my patrol, taking a longer route that avoided the section of trail where I'd encountered it. My hands shook as I walked, and I kept checking over my shoulder to make sure nothing was following me. The rest of the patrol passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the memory of those intelligent eyes studying me from behind that impossible rack of antlers. Tyler would have approached the deer, probably tried to help it, or figure out what was wrong with its skull. Tyler would have made eye contact and tried to communicate with whatever was looking back at him. I reached the station just after 9 p.m. My nerves wound tight and my muscles aching from the constant tension of being watched. The building looked small and vulnerable in the darkness, its windows glowing yellow against the black forest that surrounded the clearing. I checked every door and window twice before settling in for the night, testing the locks and making sure the deadbolts were properly engaged. Tyler's empty bed seemed to watch me as I got ready for sleep, a reminder that following the rules was the only thing standing between me and whatever had taken him into the trees. But for the first time since arriving at the station, I felt like I understood what I was dealing with. The rules weren't suggestions or liability protection. They were survival instructions written in the blood of 11 missing rangers who had thought they knew better. I pulled the rules list from my pocket and read through it again, memorizing each word. Tomorrow I'd be alone on these trails again, surrounded by things that looked normal until you got close enough to see the wrongness hidden underneath. I planned to come back alive. I finished updating my patrol log and checked the time on my radio, 6:30 p.m. Robert had emphasized the importance of checking the perimeter fence before dark, especially the sections that bordered the deeper wilderness areas. The fence wasn't meant to keep anything out. It just marked the boundaries between the maintained trails and the places where people disappeared. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out the back door of the station, following a narrow maintenance path that led to the eastern fence line. The air felt cooler tonight, with a crispness that suggested autumn was settling into the mountains for good. My boots found their rhythm on the packed dirt, and I let the familiar motion ease some of the tension that had been building in my shoulders since Tyler's disappearance. The fence itself was nothing impressive, just 4-foot chain link with metal posts every 12 feet. Most of it was in decent shape, though I found a few places where fallen branches had bent the mesh or where deer had pushed through to create small gaps. I made notes on a clipboard marking the locations that would need repair work when the maintenance crew came up next month. I'd been walking the fence line for about 20 minutes when I heard it. A whistle, clear and melodic, coming from somewhere in the trees on the other side of the fence. Not the sharp blast of someone trying to get attention, but a musical phrase. 5 notes in a descending pattern that hung in the evening air like a question waiting for an answer. My hand went automatically to the rules list in my jacket pocket, but I didn't need to read it. Rule number 3 was burned into my memory. If you hear whistling in the forest, whistle back the same pattern immediately. Do not try to locate the source of the sound. I pursed my lips and repeated the 5-note pattern as accurately as I could manage. The melody felt strange in my mouth, like I was speaking a language I didn't understand, but somehow knew the pronunciation for. The response came immediately. The same 5 notes, but this time from a slightly different location, maybe 30 yards to my left. I whistled back again, matching the pattern exactly. This continued for several minutes, the unseen whistler moving through the forest while I stood at the fence, our musical conversation creating an odd kind of dialogue that didn't require words. Each exchange felt deliberate, purposeful, like the whistler was trying to communicate something specific. Then the pattern changed. Instead of the original 5 notes, I heard a longer sequence, 8 notes this time, with a more complex rhythm. I did my best to whistle it back, stumbling slightly on the timing, but managing to hit most of the pitches correctly. The whistling began to move, and I found myself following along the fence line without really thinking about it. Each new pattern drew me further away from the section I'd been checking, leading me north along the boundary until I reached a part of the fence I'd never seen before. Here, the forest felt different, wrong, somehow. The trees grew too close together, their branches intertwined in ways that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. Even with my flashlight, I couldn't see more than 10 feet into the woods. The air smelled stale, like vegetation that had been rotting for years without ever fully decomposing. The whistling guided me past this section quickly, never pausing or allowing me to linger near the unnatural darkness between those twisted trees. I found myself walking faster, eager to get away from whatever was hiding in that tangled mass of branches and shadows. After another few minutes, the whistling led me back to a familiar part of the fence, the section that connected to the main trail system I'd been patrolling for the past few days. The melody played one final time, a gentle conclusion to our strange conversation, then faded into silence. I stood there for a moment, looking back toward the dark section of forest I'd been guided away from. For the first time since Tyler's disappearance, I felt like something in these mountains might actually be protecting me. Whatever had been whistling in the trees hadn't led me into danger. It had steered me away from it. The feeling was unsettling in its own way. I'd grown accustomed to viewing the forest as hostile territory filled with things that wanted to hurt me. The idea that something out there might be benevolent, even helpful, challenged everything I'd learned about survival in this place. I finished checking the accessible sections of fence and started the walk back to the station. The maintenance path wound through a mixture of pine and hardwood forest, well marked and easy to follow even in the growing darkness. I'd walked this route dozens of times already, and the familiar landmarks helped me navigate without having to focus too much attention on where I was going. That's probably why it took me so long to notice the figure standing in the middle of the path. At first glance, he looked completely normal. A man in his 30s wearing a standard Park Service uniform, green shirt, khaki pants, and a baseball cap with the official logo. He stood perfectly still in the exact center of the trail, about 50 yards ahead of me, like he was waiting for something. Another ranger, maybe. Someone Robert had sent to check on me, or a replacement for Tyler who'd arrived earlier than expected. I raised my hand in greeting and started walking toward him. That's when I noticed the wrongness. His movements were too smooth. When he began walking toward me, there was no natural bob or sway to his gait, no shifting of weight from one foot to the other. He seemed to glide across the ground rather than step on it, maintaining perfect vertical alignment as he covered the distance between us. His face remained completely expressionless. No friendly smile, no acknowledgement of my wave, no change in his features at all. Just a blank mask of skin stretched over bone, with eyes that never blinked. Rule number 4 surfaced in my mind like a life preserver. If you encounter anyone on the trails who appears to be human, but does not behave in a completely natural manner, do not acknowledge them, speak to them, or make eye contact. Turn around immediately and take an alternate route to your destination. I stopped walking and lowered my hand. The figure continued its smooth approach, covering ground with that unnatural gliding motion. Its head was turned directly toward me, but the facial expression never changed. No curiosity about who I was or why I'd stopped. No normal human reactions at all. I forced myself to turn around and start walking back the way I'd come. Every instinct screamed at me to look over my shoulder, to check whether the thing was following me, but I kept my eyes focused on the path ahead and concentrated on putting distance between myself and whatever was wearing that ranger uniform. The alternate route to the station would take me almost an hour longer, looping through the Southern Trail system before connecting back to the main access road. I'd studied the maps enough to navigate it in the dark, but the thought of spending extra time in the forest with that thing behind me made my hands shake. I walked for about 10 minutes before I couldn't resist checking anymore. I glanced back quickly, expecting to see the false ranger still gliding toward me with that expressionless face. The path was empty. Nothing but shadows and the normal shapes of trees in the darkness. No sign that anyone had ever been standing there at all. But I could feel those unblinking eyes watching me from somewhere in the darkness. The radio woke me from a restless sleep at 6:15 in the morning. I'd been tossing and turning since 3, unable to shake the memory of that false ranger gliding down the trail with its expressionless face. My body felt heavy and sluggish as I reached for the handset, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Base station, this is dispatch. Go ahead, dispatch. We've got a report of a deceased individual near Devil's Creek, approximately 2 miles northeast of your location. Hikers called it in about 20 minutes ago. Can you respond to document the scene for County Sheriff? I sat up and rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog from my brain. A body meant paperwork, photographs, and coordinating with law enforcement. Standard procedure for any death on park property, even if it looked like natural causes. Copy that, I'll head out there now. Sheriff's department is en route, but they're about an hour out. Just secure the scene and get initial documentation. I gathered my equipment, camera, notebook, evidence bags, GPS unit, and stuffed everything into my pack along with extra batteries and a first aid kit. The morning air was crisp and clean, with none of the oppressive weight that seemed to settle over the forest after dark. Birds called to each other from the canopy above, and I could hear the distant sound of running water from the creek system. The trail to Devil's Creek followed an old logging road for the first mile, then branched off onto a narrower path that wound through stands of white pine and oak. I'd studied this section of the map, but never hiked it before. The terrain was rougher than the trails closer to the station, with more elevation change and rocky patches that required careful footing. Devil's Creek itself was a fast-moving stream that tumbled down from the higher elevations in a series of small waterfalls and pools. The sound of rushing water grew louder as I approached, masking the normal forest noise and making everything feel more isolated. According to my GPS, I was getting close to the coordinates dispatch had given me. I found the body about 50 yards downstream from where the main trail crossed the creek. An elderly man in hiking clothes, lying on his back beside a large boulder. His skin had the waxy pallor of someone who'd been dead for several hours, and his lips were blue from cold exposure. No obvious signs of trauma or violence, just an old man who'd probably gotten lost, spent the night in the woods, and died from hypothermia. I started with photographs, documenting the scene from multiple angles before getting close enough to disturb anything. The camera's digital display showed clear images of the deceased, the surrounding area, and the personal effects scattered nearby. A small day pack, water bottle, and a folded trail map that had blown against a fallen log. That's when I noticed the shadow. It was cast on the ground about 3 feet to the left of the body, a perfect human silhouette lying flat against the dirt and fallen leaves. The outline was crisp and dark, like someone was standing directly above it blocking the morning sun. But when I looked up, there was nothing there. No tree branches, no rock formations, no clouds. Just empty sky and bright sunlight. I moved to my right to get a better angle for the next photograph, and the shadow seemed to pulse slightly. Not like it was moving exactly, but like it was breathing. The edges flickered just enough to catch my peripheral vision, creating the unsettling impression that the shadow belonged to something alive. Rule number 5 came back to me with perfect clarity. If you see shadows that do not correspond to any visible object, do not look directly at them for more than a few seconds. Leave the area immediately. I lowered my camera and started packing my equipment without taking my eyes off the ground. My hands moved quickly but deliberately, stuffing everything back into my pack with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that hesitation could be fatal. The shadow remained motionless in my peripheral vision, but I could feel it watching me somehow. The hike back to the station felt longer than the trip out. I maintained a steady pace, not running but not dawdling either. About halfway back, I started hearing footsteps behind me on the trail. The rhythm matched my own exactly. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I stopped to check my GPS, they stopped too. I never turned around to look. Whatever was following me could keep following as long as it stayed behind me and didn't try to get ahead. The important thing was reaching the station and getting back to documented normal reality. The footsteps faded when I reached the clearing around the station, but I didn't feel safe until I was inside with the door locked behind me. I called dispatch immediately and reported finding the deceased male at the coordinates they'd provided. Apparent death by exposure, no signs of foul play, scene secured and photographed for Sheriff's Department investigation. I didn't mention the shadow. The sheriff's deputies arrived around 11 and asked me to guide them back to the scene. I led them along the same trail, pointing out landmarks and explaining what I'd found. The body was exactly where I'd left it, along with the scattered personal effects. But when I glanced toward the spot where the shadow had been, there was nothing unusual, just normal patterns of light and shade from the trees overhead. The deputies took their own photographs and measurements, collected the man's belongings, and called for the coroner. Standard procedure for an unattended death. They asked a few questions about the trail system and whether I'd seen any other hikers in the area, but the whole process was routine and professional. After they left with the body, I spent the afternoon updating my incident report and organizing the photographs I'd taken. The images looked normal on my camera's display. Just an old man who died alone in the woods. No unexplained shadows, no signs of anything supernatural. Whatever I'd seen that morning had apparently decided not to show up for the official documentation. Robert arrived just before 5 o'clock, earlier than his usual evening check-in. He seemed more tense than normal, asking detailed questions about the body's condition and the exact location where I'd found it. When I mentioned Devil's Creek, his expression darkened. "You follow all the protocols when you were out there?" he asked. "Yes." "See anything unusual?" I hesitated for a moment, then decided honesty was probably the better policy. There was a shadow on the ground that didn't match anything visible. I packed up and left as soon as I noticed it. Robert nodded like this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. He walked to his filing cabinet and pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before. Thinner than the missing persons files, but with the same worn edges that suggested frequent use. 3 years ago, I sent a ranger named Pete Morrison to investigate a similar scene at Devil's Creek, Robert said, opening the folder to reveal a photograph of a young man in uniform. Hiker reported finding a body, just like today. Pete went out to document everything for the sheriff's department. He turned the page to show crime scene photos. Scattered equipment, a first aid kit, and a radio lying in the dirt beside the creek. But no body. No ranger. Sheriff found Pete's gear spread around the same area where you were today. Camera was still there, but the memory card was missing. Radio was working fine, but nobody could raise him on any frequency. Search teams combed those woods for 2 weeks and never found so much as a footprint. Robert closed the folder and locked it back in the cabinet. Pete had been here 8 months, long enough to know the rules, experienced enough to handle routine calls, but something about that place got to him. The shadow? Could be. Could be something else entirely. Robert checked his watch and headed toward the door. Point is, you did the right thing today. Pete probably saw the same thing you did, but he decided to investigate instead of following protocol. After Robert left, I sat at my desk and thought about Pete Morrison. 8 months of successful patrols, following the rules, surviving everything these mountains could throw at him. Then one routine call to Devil's Creek, and he vanished without a trace. I pulled out my camera and scrolled through the photographs from that morning, looking for any detail I might have missed. The images were sharp and clear, showing the deceased man from multiple angles. In the background of several shots, I could see the area where the shadow had been, but there was something else. In one photograph, taken from a slightly different angle, I could make out what looked like equipment partially hidden under some fallen leaves. A camera strap, maybe, or part of a radio antenna, something that didn't belong to the elderly hiker. I zoomed in as far as the camera would allow, but the resolution wasn't good enough to be certain. It could have been natural debris, or shadows from the overhead branches, or just a trick of the lighting. Or it could have been Pete Morrison's missing gear, still lying where he'd dropped it 3 years ago when whatever owned that shadow finally caught up with him. I stared at the computer screen, typing the final details of my incident report from Devil's Creek. The photographs were uploaded to the department database, and I'd documented every relevant detail about finding the elderly hiker's body. What I hadn't included was anything about the shadow that shouldn't have existed, or the footsteps that followed me back to the station. The cursor blinked at the end of my last sentence. I saved the file and leaned back in my chair, rubbing my neck where tension had been building since Robert's visit. That's when I heard the screaming. A woman's voice, desperate and terrified, calling for help from somewhere deep in the forest. The sound carried clearly through the station walls, piercing the evening quiet with raw panic. Every word was distinct enough that I could tell she was begging someone to save her, pleading for anyone to come find her before it was too late. My chair scraped against the floor as I stood up, my body moving toward the door before my brain caught up. Someone was in real trouble out there. A person who needed help, not some supernatural trick or forest creature mimicking human sounds. This was different from the baby crying that had lured Tyler into the trees. But was it? I stopped with my hand on the doorknob, the woman's screams echoing through the darkness outside. Rule number 1 was clear about not pursuing crying sounds. But did that extend to other calls for help? Robert had mentioned something about voices calling after dark when he'd talked about Jennifer Hawkins, one of the missing rangers. The screaming continued, coming from the northeast section of forest, beyond the main trail system. Each cry sounded more desperate than the last, filled with genuine terror and pain. Whoever was out there was hurt, probably badly, and every second I stood here could be the difference between life and death. I grabbed my radio with shaking hands and called dispatch. This is base station. I'm hearing what sounds like a woman calling for help from the forest northeast of my location, requesting guidance on response protocol. Static crackled for several seconds before the dispatcher came back. Copy that, base station. Are you able to determine the caller's exact location? Negative. Sound is coming from approximately half a mile out, but I can't pinpoint it without leaving the station. Stand by for instructions. The radio went quiet, leaving me alone with the woman's screams and my own racing thoughts. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to grab my first aid kit and run toward that voice. But Tyler's fate kept me rooted in place, my hand gripping the radio so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The screaming went on for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. Sometimes it would fade, as if the woman was moving deeper into the forest, then surge back with renewed intensity. She called for her husband David, begged someone named David to stop, then went back to pleading for anyone to help her. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the screaming had been. I stood at the window, straining to hear any sound from the forest, but there was nothing. No calls for help, no movement in the trees, no indication that anyone was out there at all. My radio crackled back to life. Base station, Sheriff's Department is responding, but they're 40 minutes out. If you can safely investigate and render aid, you're cleared to proceed. Use extreme caution and maintain radio contact. I looked at my GPS unit and marked the approximate direction the screams had been coming from. The sound had been consistent enough that I could triangulate a rough location, somewhere near the creek system that fed into Devil's Creek, but higher up the slope toward the ridgeline. I packed my first aid kit, extra batteries for my flashlight, and a portable radio. The walk to that section of forest would take me about 15 minutes if I followed the marked trails, then another 10 minutes of bushwhacking through the trees to reach the area where the screaming had originated. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness ahead of me as I left the station and headed northeast. The familiar trail markers reflected the light back at me, reassuring signs that I was still in documented map territory. But with each step away from the station, I felt like I was crossing into something else entirely. The forest felt different tonight. Not hostile exactly, but watchful. Like every tree had eyes hidden in its bark. Every shadow contained something that was tracking my movement through the darkness. I kept my radio in my hand and checked in with dispatch every few minutes, confirming my location and status. When I reached the point where I'd have to leave the marked trail, I stopped and listened carefully. No sounds of movement, no calls for help, no indication that anyone was nearby. Just the normal noise of wind through branches and small animals moving through the underbrush. I used my GPS to navigate through the trees, pushing through thick stands of pine and oak toward the coordinates I'd marked. The terrain was rougher here, with fallen logs and rocky outcroppings that forced me to move slowly and watch each step. My flashlight beam swept back and forth, searching for any sign of the woman who'd been screaming. I found her tied to a large oak tree about 50 yards from the creek. She was alive but barely conscious. A woman in her 30s with dark hair matted with blood, her wrists bound behind the tree with what looked like zip ties. Her face was swollen and bruised, and her clothes were torn in several places. She lifted her head when my flashlight found her, squinting against the brightness. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Please help me." I knelt beside her and started cutting through the zip ties with my knife, talking in a calm voice to keep her focused on my presence rather than whatever had happened to her. "You're safe now. I'm James. I'm with the Park Service. An ambulance is on the way." The plastic ties were thick and had been pulled tight enough to cut into her wrists. Blood had dried around the edges where she'd struggled against them. When I finally got her hands free, she collapsed forward into my arms, sobbing with relief. "What's your name?" I asked, helping her sit up against the tree trunk. "Sarah. Sarah Collins." She wiped blood from her mouth with the back of her hand. "My husband David brought me camping. We were supposed to be here for the weekend, just the two of us." "Where is David now?" Her face crumpled and fresh tears started flowing. "He went crazy. We were sitting by our tent after dinner, and he grabbed me and started hitting me. I don't understand why. David's never hurt me before, never even raised his voice. But tonight, he was like a different person." I opened my first aid kit and started cleaning the worst of her cuts while she talked. Most of the injuries looked superficial, but she was going to need proper medical attention for the head trauma. "He dragged me out here and tied me to this tree," Sarah continued. "Said he was going to leave me for whatever lives in these woods. That was hours ago, and I've been calling for help ever since. What happened to David? Where did he go?" Sarah's eyes went wide with remembered terror. "Something took him. I heard him screaming, fighting with something in the darkness. It went on for maybe 10 minutes, then everything went quiet. I thought maybe he'd gotten away, but he never came back." I helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as we started the slow walk back toward the trail. She was weak from hours of struggling against the restraints, and her balance was off from the head injury. "Before you came," she said as we navigated around a fallen log, "I heard other people calling for help. 3 or 4 different voices coming from different parts of the forest. I called back to them, told them where I was, but none of them ever came. What did the voices sound like? That's the thing. Sarah stopped walking and turned to look at me, her eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. At first they sounded normal, people in trouble asking for help. But after a while, I started noticing they weren't quite right. The timing was off, like they were repeating the same phrases over and over, and the voices didn't get tired or hoarse, no matter how long they kept calling. We reached the marked trail, and I radioed our position to dispatch, confirming that I'd found the victim and was escorting her back to the station. The response time for the ambulance was still another 30 minutes, which meant I'd need to drive Sarah down to the main road to meet them. That's when I knew they weren't human, Sarah said as we walked along the familiar trail markers. Whatever was calling for help out there, it was the same thing that took David. It was trying to lure someone else into the forest. Back at the station, I got Sarah cleaned up and gave her hot tea while we waited for the emergency vehicles. She sat wrapped in a blanket, staring at the maps on the wall and asking questions about the area. How many people went missing here? How long had the Park Service known about the dangers? Why didn't they warn people? I didn't have good answers for any of her questions. When it was time to leave for the ambulance, Sarah grabbed my arm as I helped her into my truck. "Thank you for waiting," she said. "I know you heard me screaming right away. I could tell from how quickly you found me after I stopped calling. But you waited until it was safe, didn't you?" I nodded, unable to find words for how close I'd come to running toward her voice the moment I'd heard it. "David would have come running right away," Sarah continued. "He was always trying to be the hero, always rushing to help people without thinking about the consequences. That's probably why whatever's out there was able to get him so easily." We drove down the mountain road in silence, my headlights cutting through the darkness ahead of us. At the bottom of the hill, I could see the flashing lights of the ambulance and police cars waiting at the designated meeting point. As the paramedics loaded Sarah into the ambulance, she caught my eye one more time. "The voices weren't random," she said. "They knew exactly what to say to make someone want to help. They sounded like real people in real trouble. If you hadn't known better, you would have believed them completely." I watched the ambulance disappear around a curve in the road, its lights fading into the distance. Sarah was safe, but David Collins had become another name for Robert's logbook, another person who'd thought they could help someone in distress without considering what might be waiting in the darkness. Back at the station, I updated my incident report and added Sarah's rescue to the official record. What I didn't include was her description of the inhuman voices calling for help, or the way those voices had tried to mimic genuine distress calls. But I understood now why the rules existed and why they were written the way they were. They weren't just about avoiding dangerous creatures or supernatural phenomena. They were about learning to distinguish between what was real and what was hunting in these mountains, using our own instincts and compassion against us. The things in the forest had studied us well enough to know exactly what sounds would make us abandon our safety and run toward danger. They understood that humans couldn't resist helping someone in distress, even when that help would cost us our lives. Rule number 1 wasn't about ignoring people who needed help. It was about waiting long enough to determine whether those people were actually human.